Hello, everyone. I just wanted to take some time to go through the historicity of what happened after the Michelson-Morley experiment. So many people seem to think that the result of the Michelson-Morley experiment was to disprove the luminiferous ether. Does not exist, right? If you go look online for anything about this, that's where you'll end up. So let's start there, right? So let's see what Michelson-Morley had to do with on the Wikipedia here. It says, an attempt to measure motion of Earth and the luminiferous ether. Almost. They got the dates wrong. And their conclusion was, let's see, what do they say it was? Oh, no effect was seen, so ether drag are disproven. Incorrect, right? This is the incorrect version of what happened here. We'll show you that, but just so you're clear, if Michelson and Morley disproved the ether when they did their experiment in the late 1800s, then what in the world are all these other people studying since then? So what we have now is a timeline in the historicity of ether experiments and research papers as put forth by the scientific community over the last 100 or so years. So we have the Fitzgerald-Lorentz effect from Hicks in 1902. There's also some before 1900, but timeline won't include that. We have Lorentz coming through with electromagnetic phenomena in a system with any velocity other than light in 1904. Relative motion of the Earth and the ether by Michelson in 1904. Report of an experiment to detect the Fitzgerald-Lorentz effect, 1905, by Dayton Miller. Also by Dayton Miller, extract from a letter dated Cleveland, where he goes over the interferometry readings of the ether wind and how it affects the speed of light. And then there's a couple on the theory of experiments that detect aberration of the second degree. Again, Dayton Miller obviously continued his experiments after Michelson-Morley. So maybe he was studying nothing, is what you're saying? There was the Sagnac, who put it out in 1911, the luminiferous ether demonstrated by the effect of the relative wind of ether in an interferometer in uniform rotation. Well, that seems like a very specific topic that shouldn't need to be studied because the ether has already been disproven, right? And then continuing to 1913, we have Albert Michelson, the effect of reflection from a moving mirror on the velocity of light. And of course, preliminary experiments on the velocity of light as well. Sagnac again in the 1913s. Luminiferous ether demonstrated by the effect of the relative wind of an ether in an interferometer in uniform rotation, and on the proof of the reality of the luminiferous ether by the experiment of the rotating interferograph. Then we have Sagnac again in 1913, the existence of the luminiferous ether demonstrated by means of the effect of a relative ether wind in a uniform rotating interferometer. Again, that's what Dayton Miller has studied extensively to the tune of 5,200,000 measurements. Of course, we have Einstein coming through with ether and the theory of relativity, and Ludwig with the propagation of light in rotating systems. Boy, there seems to really be something important or different about the effect of light in a moving rotation system that people seem to be studying, but I'm sure it's definitely unrelated. Then we have Silberstein coming out with the ether drift experiments at Mount Wilson Solar Observatory, and that's just critiquing and examining Dayton Miller's work. Dayton Miller again putting out the same work and along with the theory of optics. And Paul Drude coming along with his own independent study, the effect of Earth's rotation on the velocity of light. Again, very weird. They must all be studying independent statistical anomalies that Dayton Miller kept congregating, right? We have Ludwig Silberstein coming in again with, in 1925, the relativity theory and ether drift. Michelson and Gale and Pearson again with the effect of Earth's rotation on the velocity of light, with some experiments, but again in 1925. And the significance of the ether drift experiments of 1925 at Mount Wilson. So Dayton Miller also produced those experiments, did the experiment, and then the analysis as well in the same year he published. Dayton Miller again, ether drift experiments at Mount Wilson. Michelson Henry Gale, the effect of Earth's rotation on the velocity of light, volume 2. I mean, these people are all studying the same effect in all different times, all different ways, all different places, but the ether was disproven. So what are they doing, guys? What are they studying? Michelson studies in optics and repetition of the Michelson-Morley experiment. Got to repeat that measurement of nothing, right? Super important. And again, Albert Michelson, the measurement of the velocity of light between Mount Wilson and Mount San Antonio. That one is particularly interesting when he goes over the impact of latitude and altitude. And then again, we have Miner and the experiment of Miller and the hypothesis of dragging along the ether up in 1927. And then, of course, Dayton Miller again, doing more experiments through the 30s and more publications on the previous experiments, and of course combating his objections for his naysayers and haters. And he did ether drift experiments in 1929 and other evidences of solar motion. And again, he thought that was evidence of the solar motion. That's what he thought he was measuring, a very low Earth's orbital velocity. But They did it again in 1929. Some other competitive papers publicized in 29. Is there an ether? Solar system revolving through space. Things on Miller, and explains the ether drift and the function of the interferometer. And again, it goes through 1929, where people are publishing challenging papers. The two disagree on scientific precept. The case event continues attack on Einstein theory. It started to demonize him in the news, you can see. Tate and Miller again doing experiments in 1929. Ether drift experiments in other absolute motion of the solar system and the orbital motion of Earth determined by the ether drift experiment. Tate and Miller again pumping through to 1930 and other evidences of solar motion. Then we have Kennedy EM coming out with the experimental establishment of the relativity of time. Again, must be unrelated. 1933, David Dietz. Cases Miller seen hero of revolution, new revelations on the speed of light. Hint, change in Einstein's theory. Now, isn't that a very telling title? So, continuing to 1935, we have the ether drift experiment and the determination of the absolute motion of Earth by Tate and Miller. Dietz again coming in 1933 with Miller seen hero of the revolution again, and he has a second publication. We have Albert Michelson, Peace, and Pearson coming out with the measurement of the velocity of light in a partial vacuum, adding some new variables to detect the new motion and its impact on the speed of light. And we have new publications coming up all the time. 1936, new evidence held to upset Einstein, existence of the ether scene. That's weird. This is well after they've already been disproven, so I don't know what they're all so worried about. We have 1938, Robert Millikan, biographical memoir of Albert Abram Michelson. Again, his work and contribution as the most influential experiment of all time. That's what the Michelson-Morley experiment is. And then a little bit later, we have 1942, Plumer Dufour, publishing on a fringe displacement of fringes recorded on a platform in uniform rotation. Again, very evidently on the speed of light in a rotating system. And 1943, Harvey Fletcher, biographical memoir of Dayton Clarence Miller. So that's just a tribute to the impact and effect that that man had on science as well. And again, Michelson and Pearson in 1951, the measurement of the velocity of light in a partial vacuum. And then other people picking up the tale here. 1952, William Reich, cosmic superimposition. Now, you may not think that's related, but read it and you let me know. And 52, we have statistical analysis of interferometer data. Must be having to do with Tate and Miller's insistence on using the interferometer to show the change of the speed of light in a motion. And we have Shankland, our favorite Shankland, hired by Einstein. Analysis of the interferometer observations of Tate and Miller. You could read that one as well. It comes to very different conclusions than all the other papers, so keep that in mind. And then we have Shankland again, all the way through 1964, and again in 1973. So we have John Chappell in the 65 doing George Sagnac and the discovery of the ether. He obviously put the pieces together and published his work showing the same. E.J. Post on the Sagnac effect, again showing the speed of light varying in different directions. And continuing in 1981, Margaret Kimball interviewing with Robert S. Shankland. And again, you should check that out, and it exposes what the goal was for all of his critique and how he was hired by Einstein. James DeMeo, 1989, chapter on independent discovery of an unusual energy. Again, that's leading to the ether and the ether wind and its effect on the speed of light. And again, the same, a couple of years later, here's the Orgone energy continuum, some old and new evidence. Of course, he also went with the independent discovery of a dynamic biocosmic energy in space and atmosphere. Again, these people are all heliocentrists who believe the Earth moves around the sun, and that's what that motion represents. So here's his interpretation of that motion and why it affects directionality. And then we have Elias, one of the most important scientists of our time. He discovered that the effect on the pendulum has to do with the eclipse, and the eclipse affects the spinning pendulum. But in this case, he's publishing his findings on experiments of Tate and Miller and the theory of relativity. R. Cohen, 1997, does the cosmos have a direction? Isn't that weird that 1997, 100 years after the ether's been disproved, we're seeming to have the effects of a preferential direction in the speed of light? Wonder why that is. In 1998, we have Manura, Michelson-Morley experiments revisited, systematic errors. Yeah, you should check that one out. It's when they say everything is wrong because it doesn't fit the globe model. Interesting position, hard to hold, I think. And then Elias again, very significant regularities in the interferomic observations of Tate and Miller. And that's just recently, so he's on the right track. And then he went with new very significant regularities in the interferomic observations of Tate and Miller. So he noticed the correlations that Tate and Miller noticed and has done his own work. And then finally, he went to review Shankland and figured out what his motivations were and what he found. And lastly, we have DeMaio again, just in 2000, Ether drift, experiment in the band of radio wave. Isn't that odd? And just to sort of tie it in with modern times, let's have a modern explanation of the effect on the ether drift with radio wave signal propagation. And this is from In the Field with Dr. Robert Bennett, PhD, on Wixit's channel, episode 3.
Showed you in the model. Suppose we send radio signals from San Francisco or New York, which are approximately at the same latitude. We send radio signals to the North Pole. What we find out is there's no delay in the signal. If we use the speed of light and we know the distance, then we can predict what the time will be for a radio signal to go between the two. So when we send signals north-south, there is no change in the arrival time. However, if we send a signal from west to east, from San Francisco to New York, the radio signal will be boosted by the ether wind, and it will arrive earlier than we expect. In other words, the speed of light will be greater than c when we go from San Francisco to New York, and it will be c minus v if we send a signal from New York to San Francisco. This is well known. No one can deny what I just described, and yet there's no explanation for this in terms of special relativity. Special relativity would say the time between these two should never change because the speed of light doesn't change. There is no c plus v, there's only a c. Tide.
And just a note on how Wikipedia frames this is important. It says the experiment compared the speed of light in perpendicular directions in an attempt to detect the relative motion of matter through the luminiferous ether. The result was negative, and that Michelson-Morley found no difference between the speed of light in the direction of movement pursuing through the ether and the speed at right angles. This result is generally considered to be the first strong evidence against ether theories. Wow. First of all, title of the paper is The Motion of the Earth Through the Luminiferous Ether. What it was detecting, what it was trying to detect, was Earth's orbital velocity. And it definitely was a null result because no one has ever detected Earth's orbital velocity, and this was the first failed attempt. So, with that in mind, you can understand that their results weren't negative or null. They measured movement. Now, what movement? They had determined that it must be the very slow movement of the Earth through ether around the sun, right? Because they were looking for a huge momentum of 30 fringe pattern, but they didn't get that. They got much smaller, 1/6 of that, because they went to measure Earth's orbital velocity, and what they did measure, what they determined later, was the Earth's rotation, right? Much smaller. Way confusing as to what they're trying to tell you here. This is ridiculous. If you want to know, you go into the actual PDF of what Michelson published back in 1887, going over what his findings were, what his plan was, and what he was trying to attempt. Wouldn't that be a better way to look at it, do you think? Oh, look, here we go. Here it is. So his preface for the abstract is based upon Airy's failure when he detected the aberration of light was soon followed by an explanation according to the emission theory. He says the effect was attributed to a simple composition of the velocity of light with the velocity of the Earth in its orbit. Difficulties in this apparently sufficient explanation were overlooked until after an explanation on the undulatory theory of light was proposed. This new explanation was at first almost as simple as the former, but it failed to account for the fact proved by experiment that the aberration was unchanged when observations were made with a telescope filled with water, that specifically denoting Airy's failure. For if the tangent of the angle of aberration is the ratio of the velocity of the Earth to the velocity of light, then since the latter velocity in water is 3/4 its velocity in a vacuum, the aberration observed with the water telescope should be 4/3 of its true value. So essentially, he was intrigued by Airy's failure, the lack of definitive motion 6 months later when you measured the light incoming to the telescope from the star, and they had intended to figure out what was going on there. Here's their setup, here's what they determined, here's very important, only the orbital motion of Earth is considered. If this is combined with the motion of the solar system, which very little is known, the result would have been modified. The experiment still therefore be repeated at the intervals of 3 months, and thus all uncertainty will be avoided. So again, they measured motion, but it didn't coincide with their expectations because it definitely wasn't Earth's orbital velocity, and they didn't know how to fit it into their model that they had. That's exactly what happened. Only later, scientists of the future said, you know what Michelson and Morley really was intending to discover when they did all their research and set up their experiment? The ether. Yeah, they're definitely looking for the ether, and they disproved it. So Wikipedia knows better than everyone else, I guess. Just something to consider. And just the whole point of this demonstration, obviously, was to show that there's way more to it than mainstream tells you. If your entire knowledge of Michelson-Morley consists of what's written on Wikipedia, then you have no idea what that experiment was about, what happened, what it led to, or its significance. So you need to look into it. If you have doubts that what we say is, the actual close to the truth, then we should look at some of the sources that we cite. Again, that timeline was produced from 150 various papers, researches, experiments, things like that. And here's the list to show you exactly how many there were, where it came from. We have a citation list that I can show to you that would link to the increment of the number that it appears on the timeline and where you can find it and who wrote it, when it was written, who was involved, etc., 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 all the way through. Each listed each citation can be produced. So if anyone wants to look through any of this stuff, you let me know. We'll give you the whole database. Thanks, everyone.